I'm Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to a special gardening and composting edition of Southwest Magazine. I'm here today in the garden of Dr. Compost and Master Gardener John Castell. Thank you for having me here today, John.
Well, welcome to my garden, Vicki. It's nice to have you here.
I'd love for you to show me around.
Yeah,
Should we take a look?
Let's go.
All right.
We'll head up this way.
So what do we have here, John?
Now, I'd like to show you some of the more simple type of composting you can do. I call this casual composting because all you do is throw your garden scraps in here and let them break down.
So that's grass from the lawnmower.
That's grass from the lawnmower. There's trimmings from trees. There's some kitchen scraps in there. There's leaves from plants in the garden.
And so how did you put this together?
You can go to a hardware store around here and they'll give you these pallets for free to take them away. And you just put a board across like that with deck screws to hold it together. It's nice and firm. And you just throw things in there. This has been going for about 5 years. The stuff at the very bottom would be harvestable if you wanted to take that off, but I've got so much in my other composters that it's just casually growing. Worms are going to be a topic we talk about more, so there's an introduction to earthworms in the garden in the compost.
Yeah.
We're happy there.
And I should mention too today, John, that this might be a big example of what you can do, but we are going to show people how to do a kitchen compost.
We're going to come back to simpler method of composting with worms. But
you were showing me the soil down here.
Yeah.
Is that the finished product?
This is what comes up from the bottom of this after it's been cut all nice and fine. And that's lovely finished compost, but that takes about 1.5 to 2 to 3 years to stuff it at the bottom. And you have to move the top, or you have to have access to the bottom. Some people do 3 sides and then put slats so they can open up the front, take the compost out of the bottom.
Ooh,
but I'll show you something that is even much simpler to do if you want to compost in your backyard, especially if you've got a lawn that you mow. You can take your grass clippings and just throw them on the ground.
Okay.
This is fairly fresh grass on the top. There's been about 2 weeks since I've started that grass. It's going to break down very nicely.
Okay.
Then just behind me, we'll go to one that's been a little over 1.5 years. And a nice simple thing you can do with grass clipping compost is similar to what we call composted hay or hay farming, where you grow things in hay. Behind me here, we will look at some potatoes that are growing in an old grass pile.
There's a deer behind us too.
Okay, well, here's something that's a lot of fun and rather little work. Is that once your compost pile of cut lawn clippings is broken down a bit, you can take, and you can grow a lot of things. You can take tomatoes and plant them down in it, or you can take potatoes, cut them up like you would normally, but open up a space, put them down in there, and the potatoes will grow down there. You can see the tops of these. These were planted just a little over a month ago.
Wow.
And they are about twice the size of my other potatoes. I've done this before, and you end up getting beautiful, clean potatoes with no blemishes. And I think they got even a nicer flavor.
Okay, wow.
And this is sort of what it looks like inside, or even more broken down like the compost we had in our hands over there. So,
when did you start this one?
This is about 2 years now from the stuff at the very bottom.
Okay.
Based on my past experience, the potatoes that I've grown in the composted grass like this end up being beautiful, no blemishes on the outside, and somehow or other I think they even taste much better than ones grown in soil. So it's a beautiful way to grow your potatoes without much work.
What are we going to see next, John?
Next I would like to show you hot composting the hard way. So if you're prepared to do a lot of work, you can have nice finished compost in 3 to 4 months.
And I think they're right here?
They're right behind us, yes. Okay.
So what do we have here, John?
I'd like to show you my favorite way of making compost. This is what I make most of my compost with. This is the finished compost.
Okay.
This is what it looks like. Smells nice and loamy. And it's really rich and lovely for the soil garden. This is what I use to enrich my gardens with.
Okay.
But I produce more than I can use, so I tend to give it away too.
And what's going on in this
And
pot?
this one is one that's just started. This is about 3 days worth of collection.
Okay.
And we've got kitchen scraps from lumberjacks, and we've got coffee grinds from honeybees. The paper is what we call brown, and the coffee grinds we call green because it's a good source of nitrogen, and the paper is mostly carbon.
Smells actually very nice.
Yeah, so this is how I make most of my compost here, and what we were doing in the community garden as well. We have 6 of these earth machine composters at the community garden, and I have 12 of them here. So it takes, with the rich source of all this organics that I have from the restaurants in town, I can fill this in a week or less. And then once I've got it filled and I'm turning it, I'll add just a little bit of garden soil because that provides the bacteria that are going to break down the organic matter that's here and make beautiful compost.
Wow. So this is what I can aspire to.
Yeah, but if you're going to do this, in order for it to work properly every day, this also needs to be turned with a compost turner. So you just push the handle down, pull it up, push the handle down, so you get it all evenly distributed. And that will get up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can cook an egg in that.
Wow. Now, for a beginner like me, is there an amateur level of composting that we could start with?
Well, you know, this one of the nice simple things, and you don't even have to come out to garden to do it, is that you can compost with worms inside the house. They call it vermiculture.
Okay.
And I'd love to show you how you can set up your own vermiculture system inexpensively with a Rubbermaid 10-gallon tote bin.
All right. Well, let's go inside then and get to it.
What I'm going to teach you today is how to do a nice, simple, inexpensive, in your kitchen or in your basement or inside the house, vermiculture, which allows you to get rid of kitchen waste and produce lovely compost that's good for your household plants inside or in your garden. What you're going to want is a tote bin. This is Rubbermaid, but it doesn't have to be Rubbermaid. And I'll point out that because worms need oxygen, you need to drill holes in the top of the lid. That's going to provide the oxygen for the worms. They'll suffocate if you don't do that. Okay, now what I want to show you inside is this is pretty much finished compost. There are probably somewhere well over 2,000 worms in here. You can't see a single one of them. They don't like light. I could give you a fancy Latin name for not liking light, but they don't like it. And you can see the top that there aren't any there. But there are lots there. And if I take this nice little scoop and I go like this and I turn that up, you can see little worms all through it. And big worms. There are banana peels in there. There are carrot peelings. There are potato peelings. You can't see any of this. This started out with paper towel, peat moss, and then all the kitchen scraps. And you end up with this lovely, smells nice, soil, compostable, or compost. It's rich, rich, rich. There's no compost richer than the vermiculture compost, or worm castings it's called. Some of the people that I show this to say, don't the worms try to escape? When the soil or the materials that they're eating, the paper, shredded paper, the peat moss, the soil and the sand is all good for them and it's a nice environment, they don't like to leave it. But because they are like us, when they break down the food, they produce carbon dioxide, water, and then they excrete uric acid and urea like we do. That's in the soil, and that tends to make the soil get acid. The worms have very sensitive skin, and that tends to burn their skin. So when the soil begins to get acid, and it will, they'll start crawling up the side. And that's your cue that it's time to add something that will neutralize that. Now, one of the best things you can do is just crushed up eggshell. The calcium slowly gets dissolved into the soil. It's good for your plants later. Now, what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to set up a small-scale vermiculture. This is a 3-gallon tote bin. There's two of them actually here. And I'm going to show you how I have made this for you, and that you will be able to phone into CHCO-TV and give them your name and phone number, and they'll draw out a winner, and the winner will be able to have this vermiculture that they can have in their kitchen, in their house, and they can convert the kitchen waste into nice compost. This lid, I've already pre-drilled the holes for you, so that you can see that's 1/2-inch diameter little holes. In the bottom, as I mentioned before, that you need holes for the excess moisture that's developed when the worms are digesting the food that's in the composter, so that the water can drip through. Otherwise, they tend to drown in the bottom of the compost. I've had that happen to me. That's why I learned about putting the holes in the bottom. So this is going to be a composter, and what I'm going to add to that is paper towel, sand, soil, and peat moss, and I'll explain each one to you. Paper is just cellulose. It's a carbon source or carbohydrate. It's like bound sugars. The worms are going to break that down into glucose or single sugars, and it'll end up being good food for them. I'm not sure how well we can digest paper, but they'll do a fine job. And by the end of 3 months, there'll be no sign of paper left at all in this. Now I'm going to add sand, and the sand for the worm is like the small pebbles that the birds eat. It sits in the crop with the food that they're eating here, and it helps to break it down. In the crop, they have muscles on the side, and the worms will be grinding that up, and the sand that's in here will help them to be able to digest the food. So there, we're going to add sand in there. So paper, shredded paper, sand. Now I'm also going to add some peat moss. Now one of the things about peat moss that it adsorbs moisture. It helps to keep the compost bin moist without being dripping wet, so they can still breathe, but it keeps them from drying out. So we add quite a bit more peat moss, almost as much by mass as we did with the paper towel. The worms, this is, again, a lot of that is carbohydrate material, cellulose and other moss, peat moss materials. And finally, just as we and almost all animals that eat anything need the help of bacteria, you need a source of bacteria to help the worms digest the food. This is a mixture potting soil that has been with plants in it, and it was out in my garden. And this provides, now it also has perlite, and that also sort of spaces out and helps to aerate the compost for the worms. But it also provides a source of the critical bacteria that are going to help the worms break down the food. And they also play another role, because the bacteria that are there are going to begin to soften up the food that you add. So you put in carrot peelings, potato peelings. Worms don't have big external teeth, so they would have a difficulty eating it. The bacteria help to soften the food so the worms can eat it and convert it into worm casting. So we also needed that. Soil, shredded paper, sand, peat moss. And the final ingredient that I need to add is water. This is too dry. The worms would dry out and die in there. This is a collector for the liquid that comes through the compost and out. You can call it compost tea. So I'm going to add soil. I'm going to add it slowly. What I want is this to be moist to the feel, but it shouldn't be dripping. If it's too wet and drippy, the worms won't be happy. So I have to mix it and keep on adding water. But I don't want, if you pick it up and squeeze it, water shouldn't come out. Now this makes your hands kind of messy. That's why I've got rubber gloves on. or latex. Now, that's almost just how it should be. A little bit more water. The newspaper there's still a little bit wet. And the soil and the sand and the peat moss has all been mixed in. Now what I'll do is I'll rinse my gloves off. Just dribble a little bit more in there. We're almost done, you know. So if I pick this up, there's a little bit of water dripping. So I certainly have enough, and the nice thing is I have holes that the surplus water is going to drip out. But it doesn't drip an awful lot. That's what you want. If you squeeze it, water doesn't drip out, but it all feels wet. Although I can't feel that through my rubber gloves. But I did this before, so I would have some for the demonstration. You can't see in there, but I have about 500 worms in the bottom of this. And these will be the starter worms for the compost. You start out with approximately 500, which a bunch of worms like that is a squirm, so that was a squirm of worms. Okay, now you will see, if I dump this in here, and I tip it up like that, you can see that there's a squirm of worms there. Almost 500 or so. They all look pretty healthy. They're already seeking to get away from the light. Within 5 minutes, you won't see any of the worms on the surface at all. They'll all be down there looking to feed on the peat moss and the paper. We'll eat a banana and chop up the banana peel and put it in there for them to eat. It's one of the things they seem to like. But if you want to give them an advantage and make it easier, if you start out like a banana peel and you chop it up fine, they will be able to eat it much faster. I'm going to add some coffee grounds. They're nice because they're already fine particulate material. There's enough food for your worms for almost 2 months. 2 weeks, I mean.
Go ahead.
Okay, what we're going to do is just lift this material up out of the way. Like that. So the food is going to get dumped into this corner, number 1. And then we're going to cover that back over. It's interesting to know each worm is both male and female. And they crossmate, so the male part of the worm will fertilize the eggs of the female part of the other worm, and vice versa. And you see in the worms, when you see earthworms out there, there's a little white tube on it, or a little white band around it. The female part of the worm lays the eggs in that little band, and the eggs stay in that band until they're ready to hatch. Then it'll drop off and the worms will escape into the ground, and you'll see tiny little white hairs. Looks like little white hairs, about the length of a 3-day growth on your chin. And those are the baby worms. Let me show you what we do with the vermiculture worm, the nice compost that we get after, like we just showed you how to harvest it. Now, this is the second planting of peas. I harvested the first, and in order to make this nice and rich, the vermiculture compost we've added as top dressing and added a week ago. We put the seeds in there, and you can see how lovely these sugar snap peas are coming up. And a lot of that is how rich the soil is with the vermiculture compost that we've added in there.
Wow, so even if you had your own kitchen starter kit, you could add the soil from that to your garden.
Yeah, end up getting to the point where you can get here. And it takes about 3 months in the kitchen to end up with finished product like we put in here.
Okay, well let's go back to the kitchen.
Okay, let's do that. If I want to harvest worms to give to somebody else, then I would put a plastic sheet on the table, and I would use my little scoop, and I would grab up a number of scoops like this, and I would form it in a little mound like this one over here. Now folks, after we've made our little mound of the worm plus compost on the table and allowed it to sit under the bright lights for a while, this was just swarming with worms on the surface when I put it out, and you don't see any of them now. Because I'm a little bit, I need to be able to see them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly take off the outer layer of nice finished compost all the way around. Now, occasionally I'll see one little worm that's not that far from the surface. And I keep my eyes on the pile that I've moved away because I may have included 1 or 2 worms on occasion. But as I do this, we'll end up in the end with a big bunch of worms in a big ball all together, because they will have all been looking to get away from the light until there's no way to get away from the light, because all of the compost will have been harvested off. I use a nice little bin like this. You may be wondering why I'm going to all the trouble of separating the worms from this black, lovely, rich compost. And although I'm always happy to share the worms and have somebody else have the chance to start up and have their own kitchen composter, but I also find that this is some of the richest compost that's available. Worm castings is great compost. It's good for your house plants. It's good for your garden. And it's richer than any other plant supplement that you can buy or produce. Now, we're close to the big reveal. And if I open this up now, you'll see all of these squirm of worms down here that have gone away from the light and that we can harvest out of here. Now, I did it a little bit early, but some of this compost is good to keep the worms moist and alive until I dump them into your composter that we just set up. So most of the worms were right there in the center. You can still see a few of them there. If I mound this back up like that, then they'll all go to the center of that again, and I'll harvest the last of them. But we've got a nice bunch here, and we've got a nice bunch there. So when you're ready, we'll move over and we'll add your worms to your composter. You can see here, that's the compost that was loaded with worms. Now, there was a big clump of worms that was the bottom of the bin that I added in there. They've all pretty much disappeared. I can just see one of them there, but they're all going to be down in amongst the paper, peat moss and things. And the ones that I just now collected will add together on there. These worms too will disappear away from the light and down in and begin eating up the paper, peat moss, and all that delicious worm food that's down there for them. When you harvest them in about 3 months, you'll have nice compost that you can use in your potting soil. You can use the same thing. You can add shredded newspaper, peat moss, sand and soil, and water to keep it moist, and add worms back there. Now, you'll have enough worms in 3 months that you could divide up and give half to someone else, or you could double up and have 2 of these little bins, depending on how much kitchen scraps you want to get rid of. So, folks, that's all there is to it. If you want to get rid of your kitchen scraps and be good to your earth and environment and make good compost that you can use in your gardening, that's what you can do. Simple and easy. And if you don't know where to get your worms, you can go on Google, and Google will show you places where you can pay $100 to get a squirm of worms, or you can call the worm man, and he'll be happy to share with you.
Well, John, thank you for all you've taught me today about gardening and composting. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the viewers do at home.
The best part of gardening, though, is the fruits of our labor. These are some very sweet cherry tomatoes. Why don't you try one of those? It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I've really enjoyed this.
All right, well, and thank you for watching this special gardening and composting episode of Southwest Magazine.